Celt, Anglo-Saxon, Viking, Norman. 4 words, 4 invasions, and the entire popular history of Britain in a single line. Everyone who takes a DNA test hoping to find out where their British ancestry comes from is really asking about those 4, and every ancestry company sells a pie chart that appears to answer the question. So let us actually test them, one at a time, in order of arrival, against the ancient DNA we now have, from more than 1,000 skeletons from every period of British prehistory and history. 4 groups, 4 verdicts. And I will tell you now that the results do not come out in the order anybody expects, that one of the 4 turns out to have left essentially nothing at all, and that the single largest contributor to British ancestry is not on the list, has no popular name, and is not taught in any school. By the end of this video, you will know exactly which of those 4 is inside you, roughly how much, and why the pie chart on your test is less reliable than the company selling it would like you to think. If you want history done properly rather than flattered, take a moment to subscribe. Hit the bell and let us begin. First, how any of this is measured, because it determines what can and cannot be seen. When a population arrives somewhere and mixes with the people already there, the descendants carry a blend of 2 genomes that had been separated long enough to differ. Ancient DNA lets researchers sample the incoming population, sample the resident population, and then measure how much of each is present in people afterwards. The critical limitation is this: genetics detects difference. If the arrivals closely resembled the people already there, an enormous migration can be almost invisible, and a small one can be very visible if the newcomers were distinctive. Remember that, because it explains 3 of the 4 verdicts. Test 1. The Celts. Here is the first problem, and it is not a small one. Celtic is not a genetic category. The word originally described a language family and a style of metalwork, and it was applied to Britain and Ireland in 1707 by a Welsh scholar named Edward Llwyd, who was classifying languages, not people. No ancient writer ever called the inhabitants of Britain Celts. More importantly, when researchers ran a large genetic survey of the British Isles, the People of the British Isles project published in Nature in 2015, they found no single Celtic cluster. The Welsh, the Cornish, the Scots, and the Irish are not one genetic group. They are several distinct ones, and some of them are as different from each other as they are from the English. So if you were hoping for a Celtic percentage, there is no coherent thing to measure. But there is something underneath, and it is the biggest finding in British prehistory. In 2018, a study led by Inigo Olalde analyzed hundreds of ancient genomes and established what happened when a population associated with the bell beaker culture arrived in Britain from the continent around 4,500 years ago. Within a few centuries, roughly 90% of the British gene pool had been replaced. 90%. That is not a migration. It is close to a complete demographic reset, and it is the single largest event in the ancestry of everybody in Britain today. The people who built Stonehenge were not the ancestors of the people who inherited it. Their monuments were taken over by a population that was not descended from them in any substantial way. Then, in 2022, a further study led by Nick Patterson found a second, gentler movement into southern Britain during the Late Bronze Age, around 3,000 years ago, which is now considered one of the best candidates for how Celtic languages actually reached the island. And in the Iron Age, the period when the Celts are supposed to have arrived and conquered, there is no mass replacement at all. So the verdict on the Celts is this: there was no Celtic invasion. What people call Celtic ancestry in Britain is, in genetic terms, largely bell beaker ancestry, from 4,500 years ago, plus a Bronze Age top-up, and it is the foundation everything else sits on. The largest contributor to your British ancestry is a population that arrived before Stonehenge was finished, that has no name in popular history, and that nobody sells a percentage of. You can see it most sharply in the male line. Something close to 7 men in 10 across Britain and Ireland carry a Y chromosome belonging to haplogroup R1b, and the specific branches involved arrived with the Beaker expansion. Before that event, R1b was essentially absent from Britain. Afterwards it dominates, and it still does today, 4,500 years and every subsequent invasion later. A replacement that thorough leaves a mark nothing since has come close to erasing. Every arrival discussed in the rest of this video was layered on top of it, and not one of them shifted it. Test 2. The Anglo-Saxons. This is the one that has been argued about most bitterly, because the two available positions were both politically loaded. Either Germanic-speaking migrants replaced the Britons wholesale and drove the survivors west, or a small warrior elite took power and imposed a language while changing almost nothing about the population. Historians fought over that for 2 centuries using pottery, place names, and a handful of hostile monastic sources, and could not settle it. In 2022, a study led by Joscha Gretzinger analyzed hundreds of early medieval genomes from England and the continent and settled it, and the answer was neither. Populations in eastern England after the Roman withdrawal carried a substantial majority of ancestry from across the North Sea, from the region of northern Germany, the Netherlands, and Denmark. That is a genuine, large-scale migration, considerably bigger than the elite replacement camp allowed. But the proportion varied enormously from cemetery to cemetery. Local British ancestry was present throughout. Individuals of mixed ancestry were buried alongside everyone else, under the same grave goods, with no visible distinction in how they were treated. And the whole thing falls away as you move west. Modern estimates for continental Northern European ancestry in the modern English population generally land somewhere in the range of 1/4 to 1/2, depending on the region and the method, high in East Anglia and the southeast, low in the southwest, and lowest in Wales. Verdict on the Anglo-Saxons: real, large, and the second biggest contributor to English ancestry after the Beaker Foundation. Not a replacement. An absorption that ran out of momentum before it reached the mountains. Test 3. The Vikings. Now it gets interesting, because this is where the popular imagination and the data separate hardest. In 2020, a study led by Ashot Margarian sequenced 442 genomes from Viking age remains across Europe. It is the largest study of its kind, and it produced 2 findings worth knowing. The first is that Viking was not a genetic category either. Individuals buried with full Viking grave goods, in Viking-style burials in Scotland, turned out to be genetically local. Being a Viking was a job and a culture, not a bloodline, and the raiding parties included people who had joined them along the way. The second is that Scandinavian gene flow into Britain was real, but far smaller than the historical footprint suggests. And here is the more startling result. The people of the British Isles Project, sampling thousands of people across Britain, found no clear genetic signature of Danish Viking settlement in eastern England at all. In the Danelaw, in the territory the Danes ruled for generations, where the place names are still visibly Norse, where the legal terminology survived into the modern era, nothing distinguishable. There is a technical reason for that, and it goes back to the limitation I mentioned at the start. Danish populations and the Anglo-Saxon source populations were both northern continental and genetically similar to each other. A Danish arrival into an already partly Anglo-Saxon descended population is close to invisible, because there is no clean difference to detect. So the finding does not prove the Danes left no descendants. It proves the method cannot separate them. Where the method can separate them, the answer changes completely. In Orkney and Shetland, Norse ancestry is clearly visible and substantial, with estimates around 1/4 of the ancestry in Orkney. That is the highest Scandinavian signal anywhere in the British Isles, and it fits the history exactly, because Orkney was Norwegian territory until the 15th century. Verdict on the Vikings: genuinely present, heavily concentrated in the far north and the Isles, and largely undetectable in England, not because it is absent, but because it hides behind the Anglo-Saxons. Test 4. The Normans. Here is the result that should be far better known than it is. The Normans left essentially no detectable genetic signature in the British population. Not a small one. Not a regional one. In the people of the British Isles data, there is no identifiable Norman component anywhere in Britain. Think about what that means. The Norman conquest is the single most consequential event in English history. It replaced the entire ruling class within a generation. It rebuilt the church hierarchy, imposed a new legal framework, filled the country with castles, and injected so much French vocabulary into English that the language was permanently reshaped. Every English speaker on Earth uses hundreds of Norman words daily. And demographically, it was nothing. The reason is arithmetic. The Norman arrival consisted of something on the order of 8 or 10,000 people, into a population of perhaps 2 million. They arrived as an aristocracy, not as a settling population. They took the top of society and left the bottom of it genetically untouched. And they were drawn from northern France, which by that point was itself partly descended from earlier Scandinavian settlement, meaning they were not especially distinctive to begin with. Verdict on the Normans. The most historically important invasion in British history is, genetically, close to a rounding error. And before the scoreboard, there is a fifth that nobody puts on the list, and it fails in the same way for the same reason. The Romans held Britain for close to 400 years. That is longer than the gap between the first English colony in America and now. They built the road network, founded the cities, and the province was garrisoned by an army drawn from across the entire empire, with units raised in Syria, in North Africa, in the Balkans, in Spain. In 2016, a team led by Rui Martiniano sequenced genomes from Roman-era burials at Driffield Terrace in York, a cemetery of decapitated young men that has been interpreted as gladiators or executed soldiers. 6 of the 7 were genetically indistinguishable from the local British population, closest of all to modern Welsh samples. 1 had ancestry pointing to the Middle East or North Africa, which fits everything known about how Roman armies and administrations moved people around. That is the pattern. Roman Britain was genuinely cosmopolitan at the level of individuals, with documented burials of people from across the empire, and it left no measurable population-level contribution. 4 centuries of occupation, an entire road system still in use, and a genetic footprint too small to find. Which is the same lesson as the Normans, arriving from a different direction. An empire governs, it does not necessarily settle. So there is your scoreboard, and it is inverted relative to how these things are taught. The largest contribution came 4,500 years ago, from people nobody has heard of. The second largest came from the Anglo-Saxons, and it is regionally uneven. The Vikings are real in the north, and undetectable in the south. And the Normans, who changed everything else, changed almost nothing here. The Romans, who were there longest of all, changed less than that. There is a general principle underneath that ranking, and it is worth naming because it applies far beyond Britain. The events that dominate written history are the ones that changed who held power. The events that dominate genetic history are the ones that changed who was having children, and in what numbers, over centuries. Those 2 categories overlap far less than anyone expects. A conquest can rewrite the law, the language, the church, and the map in a single decade and leave no demographic trace whatsoever. A slow agricultural expansion nobody bothered to record can replace 9/10 of a population and go unmentioned in every chronicle, because there were no chronicles and nothing about it looked like an event. History remembers the loud things. Genomes record the numerous ones. Britain happens to be one of the clearest places on Earth to watch those 2 records disagree. There is a further layer to this, and it is the most interesting thing the people of the British Isles Project found. By sampling only people whose 4 grandparents were all born close together, which strips out a century and a half of railways and internal migration, the researchers could see the older structure underneath. Britain came out divided into 17 distinct genetic clusters. And those clusters do not line up with modern counties or regions. They line up, with startling accuracy, with the kingdoms of the early medieval period. There is a boundary at the River Tamar between Cornwall and Devon that still shows up in the data. North Wales and South Wales are more different from each other than populations at opposite ends of England. Orkney stands apart entirely. That is a political map from 1300 years ago, still legible in living people, preserved by nothing except the ordinary tendency of people to marry someone from nearby. Which brings us to the practical question, which is what your test result actually means. Be skeptical of the Scandinavian percentage, in particular. It is the least reliable number on a British result, for exactly the reason the Danelaw finding illustrates. Anglo-Saxon and Viking source populations are too similar for reference panels to separate cleanly, and different companies will assign the same DNA differently depending on which reference samples they hold. Be skeptical of anything labeled Celtic, since it is not a genetic category and the label is usually being applied to a general Atlantic fringe signal. And understand what the percentages are. They are not a measurement of your ancestors. They are a statement about which reference populations your DNA most resembles, out of the panels that company happens to hold today. Change the panel and the number moves. That is not a scandal. It is what the product actually is, described accurately. Now the thing that almost nobody explains, and it reframes the entire question. There is a difference between genealogical ancestry and genetic ancestry, and it is enormous. Your genealogical ancestors are everyone you descend from. That number doubles every generation, and it goes exponential very fast. Go back 30 generations to roughly the Norman conquest, and you have in principle more than 1 billion ancestral slots, which is vastly more people than were alive. The tree folds in on itself. It becomes a net. The mathematical consequence is well established and startling. If you have any substantial English ancestry, you are almost certainly descended from essentially every person alive in England 1,000 years ago who left descendants at all. That includes William the Conqueror. It also includes his cook, his stable hands, and the people whose land he took. But genetic ancestry is different, because you only inherit half your DNA from each parent. And the shuffling means that beyond about 10 generations, most of your genealogical ancestors have contributed literally nothing to your genome. They are your ancestors. Their DNA is not in you. So both statements are true at once. You almost certainly descend from Normans. You almost certainly carry no Norman DNA. The pie chart and the family tree are answering different questions, and the pie chart is the narrower one. There are questions still open. How much Danish Viking ancestry actually exists in England is genuinely unresolved rather than answered in the negative, and better methods with higher resolution reference data may yet separate it out. The mechanism by which Celtic languages reached Britain remains a live argument, with the late Bronze Age movement the leading candidate but not a settled one. And the fate of the Romano-British population in the East during the 5th and 6th centuries is still debated. The Gretzinger data shows local ancestry surviving throughout, which rules out extermination, but the social process, whether it was displacement, absorption, intermarriage, or all three in different places, is not something a genome can describe. There is a quieter layer under all of this. Every one of those four groups arrived thinking of themselves as distinct, and every one of them dissolved. The Beaker population became the people the Celts supposedly conquered. The Britons became the people the Anglo-Saxons displaced. The Anglo-Saxons became the English who were conquered by the Normans. The Normans became English so completely that within 2 centuries their descendants were fighting France. There is no point in the sequence where a stable original population is being disturbed by newcomers. There are only newcomers, becoming the population, in time to be disturbed by the next set. So what does your result actually mean? It means you are mostly descended from a Bronze Age population that arrived 4,500 years ago and has no name in popular history. It means that if your family is from Eastern England, you carry a substantial northern continental component from the early medieval migrations. And if your family is from Wales or Cornwall, you carry considerably less. It means that if your family is from Orkney or Shetland, The Norse signal is real and large. And it means the Normans, whatever your surname suggests, are almost certainly not detectable in you. And here is what it does not mean. There is no original British population, and there never was. Every one of these groups was itself a mixture when it arrived. And the idea of a pure or founding stock does not survive contact with a single one of these studies. Choose a voice that resonates with you, and let's begin our creative audio journey together. Choose a voice that resonates with you, and let's begin our creative audio journey together. Choose a voice that resonates with you, and let's begin our creative audio journey together. Choose a voice that resonates with you, and let's begin our creative audio journey together. The next time somebody tells you their family is pure Anglo-Saxon or pure Celt, remember what the ground actually holds. One enormous replacement nobody teaches, one large migration that faded going west, one that hid behind it, and one that rewrote the language and the law and left no trace in anybody's blood at all. The science is still moving. 10 years ago, most of what is in this video did not exist. The Beaker result is from 2018, the Viking study from 2020, the Anglo-Saxon study from 2022. Some of it will be revised, and the Danish question in particular is likely to be reopened. Tell me in the comments which of the four you were told your family came from, and which part of Britain, and whether any of this matches. The regional patterns in the comments on these videos are usually sharper than the ones in the papers. Thank you for spending this time with us. The evidence is real, the science is real, and the version most people were taught was mostly a 19th century story about invasions that the skeletons do not support.